Welcome back, everybody. I'm very happy to be chairing this panel. As a historian of the Iranian left in particular, one of my specializations is Iranian left, I'm very happy that this panel actually looks at historical perspectives on the Iranian right, on the Iranian right wing, because we focus a lot on the Iranian left in public discourse, and it's always a very controversial topic, the various factions of the Iranian left, the various trials and tribulations of the Iranian left. But the Iranian right wing, the far right, has had an important presence in the Iranian political scene since at least the beginning of the 1940s, and still has a very potent presence in the Iranian public scene. At times obscured by other political transformations and evolutions, but it's, I think, a very important and ripe topic for research. So without further ado, I would like to hand the microphone over to Kaveh Azarhoosh, currently a PhD student at King's College, London, who will talk to us about the Pan-Iranist movement in particular. Please, Kaveh.
Hi, everyone. It's okay now. Okay, perfect. It's very unusual for the topic that I focus on to be quite close to what's happening around us a lot. So when I was reading and rewriting, I found myself at different points wanting to make comments about what's going on in Iran right now, but I want to get some of those out at the beginning so I can get on with my presentation. I want to express my full solidarity with everyone who's in Iran and in the strongest term, condemn the hateful accusations against minorities, in particular Baha'is and Afghans in Iran over the last 48 hours. And without any hesitation, I want to condemn the war of aggression by Israel against Iran. So with having said that, I can just focus on what happened in the past without trying to focus on similarities so much. 85 years ago, on 26th of October 1939, Reza Shah stood up in Majlis for the last time and in the opening of Majlis and tried to reassure the nation. He said, regrettably, war has broken out in Europe. Although our government's policy is one of complete neutrality, the continuation of the war will economically and materially harm all nations and threaten global civilization. We hope for peace to be established soon. Although his words were earnest, he could not hold the tide back. Less than 2 years later, on 25th of August 1941, Iran was occupied by British and Soviet forces, and despite its formal neutrality. The invasion ended the reign of Reza Shah, and his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, became Iranian king. My broader research focuses on the Iranians who, during that period, up to 1945, supported or worked closely with the Nazis in Iran or outside Iran. I use a network approach, which means I'm focused on connection between people and what they mean. And I have identified around 180 individuals, which in Iran and in Europe either worked very closely with Nazi establishments or very actively promoted their cause among Iranians. I propose in my research that these 180 people can be divided in 3 clusters, and they should be identified in these 3 clusters because of their distinct political identity that they had. The first is Berlin clusters, those who were around Radio Berlin. The second one is conservative elite, perhaps most best known around General Zahedi and Ayatollah Kashani. And last one is Pan-Iranist cluster. Today, I'm going to talk about the Pan-Iranist cluster in details. But first, for the context, I want to very briefly outline how I identify the other 2 clusters. The Berlin cluster was formed around Bahram Shahrokh in Berlin. Bahram Shahrukh returned to Berlin in 1938, and by 1939, he had managed to convince the Nazi establishment in Berlin to set up a Persian radio station targeting Iranians, a station that regularly is referred to as the first ever Persian radio station, which probably was, although it wasn't the first ever Persian radio program. That was from Radio Ankara, which was broadcasted a few months before. And Bahram Shahrukh in his memoirs says that the reason that Ankara broadcasted it meant that establishment of Radio Berlin wasn't so diplomatically aggressive. There were other people in Berlin as well. Berlin had a history of having Iranian intellectual, but in the years up to 1939, because of the industrial and academic ties established, there were a number of young Iranians there. Some, for example, Davud Monshizadeh, Shervin Bavan were involved in writing propaganda for the German magazine Signal in Persian and in Persian. Others, such as Amir Aslan Afshar, later one of the closest allies of Mohammad Reza Shah, and Ismail Kushan, later the most significant movie producer in last century in Iran, were presenters in the radio and were helping with Bahram Shahrukh in radio station. Their ideology was fiercely anti-British and anti-Soviet. They were modernists. They loved what they saw in Germany, and they wanted to replicate what they saw as modernization of Germany under Hitler in Iran. They were also selective in their racial theory and broadcasting hatred. One other thing I want to mention about them is Bahram Shah. In my research, I identified Bahram Shahrukh from 1943. He becomes a double agent and starts working very closely with the British under the code name Blackguard. That relationship facilitated the relationship of this network in post-war Iran to working with other security agencies and becoming part of Iranian bureaucratic system immediately after war. The second cluster is one that was formed in Iran. In 1941, when every German worker left Iran, a number of the agents managed to stay in Iran. One of them was a guy called Franz Mayer. Franz Mayer was a young, very ideologue Nazi operator in Iran. He stayed hidden in the Armenian graveyard in Iran for 6 months, and then started growing a beard and trying to make himself look like more Iranian, and started making connection with very well-known Iranians, including General Zahedi, Hossein Nobakht, Mohammad Hossein Hassan Waziri, and Ayatollah Qashani. The minutes of their meetings is documented in his diaries, which were confiscated by the British at his arrest in 1943. They were fiercely anti-imperialist, very authoritarian and anti-democratic, and also were very loyal to Islam as a religion. Their anti-minority rhetoric was based around religion. The anti-Semitism that they talked about in their meetings and the anti-Baha'i rhetoric that they talk about in their meeting was from an Islamic perspective. Of course, they gain power, perhaps in one of the most, as a group, perhaps in one of the most talked about episodes of Iranian history, the 1953 coup. So I don't need to talk about that a lot, but it just has to be noted that 2-year government of Zahedi was the sharpest decline of civil liberty and political liberties in Iran, and also the start of political persecution of Baha'is. But today I want to talk about the third group in more detail, the Pan-Iranists. They were a group of young Iranians. When I say young, I really mean young. I mean 17, 18 max. And they were mostly in a school. Some of the well-known ones are Dayush Homayun, Dayush Furuhar, Pezeshpur. They, as Dayush Homayun puts it, when the Soviet and British tanks rolled in Iran, they felt shame. They felt that they were let down by Reza Pahlavi. And both both Dariush Homayun and Dariush Furuhar mentioned that by their activism, they wanted to put a stop to the 150-year trend that Iran was constantly embarrassed and attacked by the regional powers. There is very little known about what they did at the time because they weren't really in the radar of the British forces or Soviet forces. They were young and they were active in what they called themselves terrorism. Dariush Furuhar, for example, became injured and until end of his life couldn't walk properly because he was trying to put together a bomb. They were very much against the old establishment. Although they had approaches from people from the old establishment, such as Sayyid Zia, who returned to Iran, they refused to be working with them and they wanted to have their own organization. When the war ended, they were one of the parties that they finally could, in 1945, they finally could come out of underground and form the party publicly. They started supporting the Pan-Iranist party. They published a pamphlet in 1947 titled Ma che mikhahim, What We Want, which was written by Pezeshpur. I want to highlight parts of that, which is one of the most comprehensive political manifestos of the right of the last century in Iran. They talk about unity. All chapters of Iranian polity are to be summed up in one word, unity. تمام فصول سیاست ملت ایران در یک کلمه خلاصه می شود. آن وحدت است. The Pan-Iranists meant unity and solidarity of all Iranians in their great homeland. They often talked about greater Iran and great Iranians. Although at that time and for the rest of the time, they were very vague whether they want a unification of greater Iran or they are happy with Iranians living in separate countries and considering that a greater Iran. They were anti-imperialist. They said we are alive and we want life. Life is not servitude. Their membership was open to. How long do I have? Okay. The membership was open to all Iranic people, Afghanis, Tajik, Kafkazis, Kurd, and Baluchs. They had a huge focus on liberation rhetoric. They also had very exclusionary language targeting at the Jews particular. They said the fraudulent domination of the Jews and those like them needs to be defeated. غلبه مزورانه جهودان و جهود صفتها. I want to talk about three specific episodes about the formation of Pan-Iranist movement and how they became how that shaped their characteristic. In 1950s up until 1951, all members of the Pan-Iranist movement were under one umbrella, the Pan-Iranist Party. But in 1951, there was a split. Dariush Furuhar formed the Hezb Millat Iran, and Pezeshpur stayed with Pan-Iranist Party. And the difference in opinion was Dariush Furuhar wanted to oppose Shah, whereas Pezeshpur wanted to act as a reformer within the system. During that time, they took part in campus politics, but not so much parliamentary politics. They attacked minorities. For example, Bijan Jazani's one of the first episodes of his political activism was defending Jewish girls' schools in Tehran from attack from the Pan-Iranist mobs. They also differed on attitude toward oil nationalization. Dariush Furuhar very vividly supported Mossadegh until the end of his life. 5 minutes. 5 minutes. After 1955, after the fall of Zahidi's government, or after change of Zahidi's government, they continued in different paths. Pezeshpur and Pan-Iranist Party were elected in parliament twice in 1967 and 1971. They He perhaps is most vividly remembered for his speech against Shah recognizing independence of Bahrain. Whereas Dariush Furuhar at the same time was arrested 3 times for political charges. In one of them, in his memoir, he recalls that while he was being arrested, as a final act of resilience, he sang a Iran a Marz Porgohar as he was being arrested. But also Dariush Furuhar wrote in June 1977, along with Karim Sanjabi and Shahpur Bakhtiar, wrote an open letter to Shah and warned him that the country is on the verge of collapse. And as a solution, they had to release all political prisoners, stick to the constitution, and respect human rights and rule of law. With the Islamic Revolution, Dariush Furuhar soon sought the role of being parliamentary and politically active in Iran. He served as a Minister of Labor, and he was asked to work as a mediator between its central government and the Kurdish forces in the first years after the revolution. Perhaps a testament on their exclusionary nationalism included Kurdish people within it, because they were seen as a trusted party both by the Kurds and central government. Also, Pezeshpur mentions repeatedly of his close friendship with Kurdish political activists such as Barzani. Finally, whereas Pezeshpur took the role of the reformer, he couldn't really be a parliamentary actor, but he was commenting in the media. For example, in February 1980, he, in an interview, he said that although they have traditionally been anti-communist and anti-left, he has been impressed by MEK, Mujahideen Khalq, and Sazman Fadayan Khalq for how their brand of leftism was Iranian, and it wasn't a Soviet brand, or it wasn't a European brand, so they could respect and work with them. Finally, I want to say that the Pan-Iranism was a very specific brand of nationalism in Iran. They were born out of regional geopolitical anxiety. They believed in organization of the people and mass party movements. They never wanted to gain power or through establishment parties, institutions, or foreign powers, although there's many episodes that they worked with foreign powers that we don't have time to get into. They were anti-democratic to a degree in their DNA, because they were very exclusionary towards the leftist organizations, but they respect parliamentary democracy for the right. And also, their only loyalty was to Iran and future of Iran, and the anxiety against Iran being broken down. I think they are very different to the caricature of, or the image of nationalists Iranian who longs for 2,500 years history of monarchy in Iran, or wants to take the clock back 1,400 years. Instead, they wanted to turn the clock back 150 years, where Iran wasn't losing international relations, and the nation states of Iran, as they saw it, was one powerful one. And the royalty changed all the time. And I think there is still a constituency of Pan-Iranists along Iranian politics. And I think with every time that power changes in Iran, they might change their role from parliamentary to opposition, and from opposition to parliamentary as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kaveh. That was very interesting and very historic. So that was really music to my ears. Next speech is Arash Gajar. He will speak about Gajar, sorry. Reading from the
That's
Latin.
a usual common mistake. Yes, that's fine.
He will discuss mediatized right-wing populism in Iran. And he is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Utrecht University.
Used to be, yes.
Used to be.
Yeah, my mistake. Yes, I used to be. It's the contract ended. And thank you very much for having me on this panel. And I'd like to specifically thank Iran Academia, Sajjad and Alireza were so kind to me to allow me to have this presentation in English again. And I would like to begin with the observation that, can we have the first one? I'd like to begin with the observation that after a woman life freedom movement, we have been witnessing the rise of what I call provisionally Iran's new right-wing populism, which is increasingly absorbing the collective energies and whose media presence is inflating, to say the least. And like the other panelists in this conference, I feel an urgency to understand this phenomenon, this contemporary phenomenon, as it may prove to be a significant force in Iran's future. And I feel like we're going to hear more about them in the coming years. And the central argument of this talk, just to put it in one sentence, is that this right-wing populism is a mediatized phenomenon. And I'll elaborate on this argument by beginning with a series of images that give a very crude glimpse into this new form of populism. And I will then turn to theory to describe this populism in conceptual terms and end with concrete examples where the concepts that I use and I propose intersect with Iran's past and present in interesting ways. And briefly, before I show the slides, still on the first one, let's not move any further for now. This form of populism is in a certain way of its evolution that invites us to understand it, not necessarily in its specificity, but to locate it within the broader map of the past and present forms of populism, which the humanities, particularly after the rise of the new right or alt-right in the Euro-American regions, have been studying in the past few decades. These images should be familiar to those who follow the situation in Iran. We've seen the same one yesterday. Sorry for the repetition. We see in them an Aryan brand of racism. We see Persian archaism, monarchist myth-making, idolization of the king, ambivalence towards Islam and feminism, which I find quite fascinating, and a desire for admission and into and acceptance by the League of the Global Right, which we will see in the last final image. The social standing of this right-wing populism, moreover, is uncertain and it's flexible. And I think I'd like to emphasize that. And at times it appears we see as scapegoats for the Islamic Republic's cyber army. We've heard that a lot of times. At others, it takes the form of an exilic post-1979 monarchist diaspora. At times it overlaps with certain segments of Iranians' contemporary youth generation, and at others it manifests as a spontaneous gathering of people of all generations around national symbols, as we had during the Nowruz of 2025, if you remember, where we had pro-Pahlavi slogans, not all of them, but some, and also one famous racist slogan. Moreover, this populism, like all forms of populism, has a complicated relationship to the past. Although it often imagines itself as a continuation of the Pahlavi dynasty, and although its right-wing tendencies to connect with Kaveh's brilliant presentation at times resemble those found during the Pahlavi era, with extreme cases such as Pan-Iranism or the Persian Nazi Pahlavi era, the Persian Nazi Party before the 1953 coup, it does not replicate or repeat those tendencies, although it has some connections to it. And here I draw from and fully agree with Turaj Atabaki when he says, and I'm paraphrasing him, that people in every period turn to the past and mediate it with the political urgencies of the present. And Atabaki has shown us this conversation with the past, especially with regard to early and mid-Pahlavi authoritarian politics and historiography. And it's interesting. If in the first and second Pahlavi era, as Atabaki has it, the necessity to retrieve and remake the past was a project shared among historians, among literary figures and statesmen, in the present era, the third Pahlavi's relationship with the past is purely mediatized. And think of Manoto's Time Tunnel program and other media contents that remember Pahlavi's glorious past. They're not historiographical in the professional sense, not political, not literary, but mediatized heritage in the making. And there is a brilliant PhD in the making. It's going to come out in a few months, precisely on this topic of Manotow's time tunnel by Nino Vabob from Utrecht University. It's a brilliant dissertation which comes out soon. But aside from that, the question then for me is, what does this new Iranian right-wing populism want, and how should we understand and conceptualize its relationship to the past? And important for me is that I do not wish to pathologize, as I said yesterday. I don't want to pathologize this form of populism. I have no normative view on it, although in its own way, a normative view is important. But this research and this view, this conceptual take is not normative. It's rather a more cultural, historical, semiotic approach to it. And as a step forward towards answering those questions, I would like to offer a general proposal for conceptualizing this phenomenon. And I would like to offer this through an approach that draws on public observation, connections to populism studies. It's a growing field. We hear about that also in the roundtable. And more importantly, media studies, also modern Iranian history and cultural studies. And as a step towards conceptualizing this phenomenon, I suggest the notion of distant right instead of far right. It's a readjustment of what we call in English far right. It's distant right signals first that the figures representing this form of populism are distant from Iran. They are far both geographically and in terms of the capacity to act to bring about change, which they do not do. And second, the movement as a whole is far removed from the actual domain of politics. Sometimes it's even anti-political, despite its political appearance. It also lacks agency. It cannot plan and implement actions, whether peaceful or violent, and of course doesn't have electoral power, which is an important theme in populism studies. And here I can make a comparison with two general categories of far right offered by Cas Mudde, political Dutch scientist, who in his very recent book, he talks about two categories of far right. He calls it radical right and extreme right. The radical right, according to Mudde, is a democratic and reformist right. It seeks radical change, granted, but through democratic means. By contrast, he also talks about extreme right or revolutionary right, which is anti-democratic, basically willing to change things by whatever means necessary. And crucially, both of these categories, both of these far rights have the capacity and power to mobilize in the street. They have agency. They have the capacity to carry out violence in public space, and most importantly, they can vote. But the Iranian distant right, at least for now, and this is one of the characteristics of populist movements before coming to power, is that they are none of these things, the Iranian ones. Its violence is discursive and verbal. It's confined to the television screens and social media posts. They don't seem to be action-based, and they're being increasingly described, as we hear very often in social media and media, as bloated balloons, which will pop up one day, probably. But the populism seem to also differ from Islamic populism, which does have agency. Its violence is both discursive and physical. It's both rhetorical and physical. It's also ideological, which is something that we lack in the distant right of Iran. And it can act politically or with or without media. Iranian right-wing populism, by contrast, lacks such agency. We have not seen any evidence of their genuine political praxis. However, and I say this with some suspicion, that this does not mean that they are irrelevant or insignificant for Iran's politics. It doesn't mean that they should be dismissed. In fact, precisely because their actions are limited to and depend on mass media, they are gaining a new form of power that needs to be understood in relation to how media work. How then, we might ask, should we think about the nature of this power? And given the lack of their action, how might we make sense of Iranian distant right, powerful inaction? And let me be clear here, this populism has real power. It's been mentioned that I might have suggested yesterday that their restriction to social media and media doesn't mean that their power is not real. Their power is quite real. It's just that the form of it we should understand better. Now, with these questions, we arrive at the concept of mediatization. The term belongs to a relatively recent paradigm in media studies. I'd like to bring that in, that the views of scholars of mediatization, although the concept has been around from as early as 1930, it's also been used by Habermas in a slightly different sense, in a more normative sense. I thought perhaps I had more time for that, but I'll skip that. But the recent paradigm that I connect with has been seminally developed by the Danish scholar of media and communication studies, Stig Harvard. It draws a distinction between what is called mediation and mediatization. So if mediation refers to the concrete act of communication through a medium within a social context, mediatization, by contrast, seeks to describe a more complex process through which social and cultural institutions, as well as modes of communication and meaning-making, are themselves transformed as a result of increasing influence of media. And then we lose the distinction between what is mediated and what is not, between basically reality and representation. And from this perspective, mediatization is a process that places media in a curious ontological position. On the one hand, media function as autonomous, as objective institutions and technologies that seem to be driven by logics exterior to us. And on the other hand, they also constitute an inseparable part of our everyday experience. They become subjective, internalized, and implicated in our semiotic behaviors, in our emotional stance towards reality, and our political engagement. Now, I think it'd be interesting to know that among the first scholars to approach politics through the lens of mediatization, and I'm talking about Gian-Pietro Mazzoleni and Winfried Schultz, maybe familiar names, very famous names in the field of mediatization, even went so far as to claim that mediatized politics, and I'm quoting, is politics that has lost its autonomy, very extreme case, has become dependent in its central functions on mass media and is continuously shaped by the interactions with mass media. Now, in this sense, within a mediatized world, it is less that politicians or even media institutions themselves are able to control the media, and more that the media, or in more accurate terms, just to be clear, ecosystems and logics of media control politics, control governance, and the media institutions themselves even. Mazzoleni even talks about the uncontrollability of media by politicians. But the degree of media control, they're not the same everywhere. It is rather contingent on historical and cultural contexts. Mediatization process can produce both anti-democratic and democratic outcomes. It may or may not facilitate transition to democracy, Iran being a real interesting case in point. So we have different degrees and kinds of media control, and among other factors, these depend on how citizens and users engage with mass media and how that engagement in turn is interpreted and appropriated by political actors and by established institutions of power. And I think at this stage it could be interesting to briefly look at how Reza Pahlavi, the main face of this distant populism, has emerged as a mediated figure in the past 2 decades or so. I owe part of this as a correction of what I said yesterday, because some of the friends and colleagues corrected me. This one owed to Negin Shiraghai, who told me a lot about this yesterday. So there was this time that he was not familiar. He was not quite a familiar face in media. People knew about him, but there was not much media content of him. Then in 2009, he tries to appear in media somehow, but fails. Then in 2012, he did the famous interview with Masih Alinejad. Around the same time, he gets a PR team around him, in order to help him be out there, and slowly builds up his media appearance. And as he evolves into what he is today, what I describe as distant right populism, also evolves with him as well. So it's an interesting process, and I'm just saying it really cryptically, I hope to some extent clear, that a mediatized process, because we see a combination of media institutions, media historical and social factors working together to create this figure and its populist reflection in society. Now, this process depends on choices made by people, by media organization, by, in this example, by the PR around Reza Pahlavi, and well, on the changing media technologies and digital affordabilities, which has brought us to the present moment. when he may be translated into politics as the most popular opposition figure, at least for some time, and thus imagined, at least during these hard times, as the main candidate for a transitional government in a hypothetical power vacuum. And all of this, regardless of his actual political competence or knowledge, and without any guarantee that he could, within the fragmented and pluralistic society of today, guide society towards a shared set of goals. And this is just one of the very important characteristics of populism, in the sense that figures produced during these processes are responsible not to society and politics, but they're responsible to the processes that made them. So they are responsible to media, not to anything external to media. And I'd like to show you an earlier phase of Pahlavi's mediatized evolution, referring to one of his earliest TV appearances to point to an interesting aspect of this mediatization. And this is an interview he gave in 1987. I showed this yesterday, talked about this. It's provided by the French television. It was made by the French television channel La Cinq, and I don't have the permission to produce it here. And if you want access, you get this information, and you can ask for access through ina.fr. And the slide contains the bibliographic information here. And we see also the slide shows the young Reza Pahlavi beside his monitor, a very old computer that he has in 1987. And there's an interesting part of this video that I asked ChatGPT to make for me because I couldn't show it, and that this describes what happens there and why it is important at this point. And it's where the journalist asks him that what are your plans for Iran? And Reza Pahlavi displays a map of Iran on his screen, also shows a number of colored circles. In response, he explains, and I'm paraphrasing here, he says that these circles represent the forces loyal to me in Iran. I monitor them on the screen. Once the circles are big enough and numerous enough, I will return to reclaim Iran. And this is just a reminder, just that this continues to carry out this illusion into the digital world. His recent social media posts, which are likely familiar to everyone, and these posts are basically showing that he still thinks that he has connections with IRGC and Basij in Iran. And this is also another excerpt from his last interview, which I showed yesterday. And just as a reminder, which basically says I couldn't subtitle this, that I have relationship with IRGC and Basij, and I have conversation with them. So these moments, they're important because these moments show that Reza Pahlavi continues to imagine that there exists a segment of Basij and IRGC loyal to the monarchy or to the people, and that one day they will support him. And this, I think, has analytic value for cultural history of media and for populism in Iran. The fact that Reza Pahlavi has remained committed to this vision from 1987 to 2020 or what should invite us to ask what kind of media environment is forming around him such that it sustains and drives such political fantasy. Now, as a media historical note, I think it's important to remember that the interview took place just 5 years before the birth of the internet, when the development of the so-called TCP/IP protocols made it possible for personal computers to connect with other personal computers and to scale globally. And this is only 3 years before the emergence of the World Wide Web. It's an earlier stage of the history of mass media in Iran, at the digital part of it. And at that earliest stage, Reza Pahlavi was already captivated by this internet imaginary, imagining decades before social media even became a thing that he has connections in Iran. So from one perspective in this example, we can see that there is this individual who is gripped by this illusion that he has connections in Iran. So it's perhaps because he's distant from Iran or whatever connections that he has to Iran. But from the other perspective, we witness how the rise of online media, and this is important, has shaped such a delusional figure, has made it possible for this figure to express this fantasy, providing him with a technological and institutional substrate for his fantasy, one that has been extended all the way to the present. And by way of a historical comparison, 2 clicks, Sajid, I think it's interesting to note that just as the introduction of wireless technology And the establishment of national radio during the battles of the airwaves in the 1940s provided the technological imaginary for the young Khomeini and for his Islamic populism. Interesting for you to know, it's perhaps you've heard about this, that Amir Tahiri in his book Spirits of Allah said how Khomeini went to Qom with a radio set in as early as 1938. So too did the advent of the internet form the network imaginary, the internet imaginary for the development of the young Reza Pahlavi and his distant populism. So we have here two distant media environments, two divergent populisms, and undoubtedly with profoundly different political and social consequences. And just pushing this towards the end, I think it would not be unimaginable that Reza Pahlavi returns to Iran and plays a significant role in some capacity for the transformation of politics in Iran. And those colored circles become real and large enough for him, perhaps one day. And I think this compels us to take media seriously as foundational in understanding the form of populism that is emerging around this figure. We should also then think seriously about this claim that it is media and not only ideas and people that make populism. And I think we should ask, as scholars, as journalists, media practitioners, and politicians, and what is happening within a media environment, and how, despite the absurdity of its content, does this environment exercise power? And I think this is a crucial question to ask today. And I'm going to conclude by just saying that, as I said, these are just fragmentary pieces in the service of proposing media studies as a key field to approach Iranian populism today. And I'm sure that there are so many questions that I haven't answered and many things I might have got wrong. And I look forward to hearing it from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Arash will have some questions now from the audience. Please. هر دو تاشو باید بگیم.
Should we go in English or Persian?
English.
Very nice. Two very nice paper. Great. Two questions for Kaveh and Arash. First for Kaveh, anything related to the link between the third tendency, Pan-Iranism, and the first two? Do we know that? And for Arash, question is that, you just focused on pro-Reza Pahlavi, the monarchist. How do you see the radical and extreme right in a camp of Republicans, Jomhuri Khahan, not Sultanat Khahan, but Jomhuri Khahan. If you go to the camp of Jomhuri Khahan, the Republican, do you see, extreme and non-extreme, democratic or radical there too? Thank you.
Yes, and I think the Pan-Iranists are very much product of the other two clusters, the formations. So Radio Berlin was the introduction of many of these people to Germany and Nazi Germany, and how Bahram Shahrukh glorified what Germany was doing during the war, regularly portraying Germany as most likely victorious until 1944, 1945. They reflect on, they created this idea that the only way for Iran to survive as a nation state when there is Imperial Britain and Imperial Russia next door to Iran is to repeat the example of Nazi Germany in many ways in terms of the modernization of politics and so on. And I also think the second cluster in terms of the political elite who were in Iran, the existence of Franz Mayer excited those like around Kashani and around Zahedi and kept them engaged with the politics of Nazism. And as a byproduct of that, was that they also created this space within politics for this kind of ideas to be expressed. For example, Senator Norbacht was closely in contact with Maya and regularly would make speeches in Iranian parliament against the Allies' forces. And this is at the time where obviously all kind of political parties were active apart from pro-Nazi political parties in Iran. So there was some contact as well in terms of individuals who went between groups, but they very much wanted to stay independent from the old elite, but they were product of their activities.
Yes, and thank you for this question. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. I have to say that I don't have much to say about this. This is something I'm going to think about, and thank you for bring that out. And I think that for the mere reason that this republicanism, as kind of similar but distinct and more sophisticated than the far right populism, is more sophisticated, it kind of pushes it towards the more thin description of populism, but I'm using thin in the sense that Kasmuda uses thin and thick populism. Thick when it's too much out there and it's a lot of bloated sort of rhetoric, but then thin, maybe it's just using on the normal level of mass media rhetoric, and maybe that's why that it didn't really caught my attention. But it's totally a lack of my attention. I have to get back to this to see what happens there, because we also have these different shades. Which have to be accounted for in terms of the modalities of populism, in terms of the degrees to which mediatization work for them or against them. Just thank you for bringing that up. Short response.
Yes, that part. You can just keep it.
دکتر عطابکی، من کوتاه میخوام اشاره بکنم که جریان پهلوی تقریبا افشاست، وضعیتش مشخصه. دقیقا جمهوریخواهایی که به نام دموکراسی و آزادی با هر جریانی میسازن و آمادن برای جنگ خارج، آماده بودن و امروز تایید میکنن، کسایی که ما باید ازشون بترسیم. مسیح علی نژاد، مریم معمار صادقی که توی در واقع مؤسسات استعماری وابسته‌ای که راه رو برای جنگ آماده کردن و الان منتظرن که این میوه رو بچینن. خطر اصلی اینجا، چون پهلوی پروکسی جمهوری اسلامی افشاست، اینا هم که آمادن برای میوه چینی. کوتاه.
Yeah. Questions for the speakers, if possible, please. Yes.
This question is in line with what Professor Atabaki just posed. Do we have an access to the official list of people who are around Reza Pahlavi, so that when we talk about, some people call it fascism, some people call it far right, but do we have access to this official list? Because to this date, I haven't been able to know who is his advisor. He never talks about it. Nobody gives any list about it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a great question. I think it came out also yesterday in another talk that there was, and I don't know if there is evidence for that, there is this person who was part of the Persian Nazi party in the 40s, is also around him today. And I haven't found, just like you, I searched, I couldn't really find lists, and I couldn't find the background of these lists. So it kind of led me to the conclusion in a more abstract way, in abstract historical way, that even if there are people around him who have these, who've had these connections with the past, I think we are dealing with a phenomenon, with a social movement that has still a complicated relationship to that past. And in the sense that I don't see, for instance, that anti-imperialist ideological stance against not the left, but generally anti-imperialism was a thing of fascism in a way which we do not see now in this sort of right-wing distant populism or distant right wing of Iran. So, and there are lots of other differences as well that makes me think that there is a break between them, even though the people from that era, even Pan-Iranists or fascists, continue to work with Reza Pahlavi or inform him in some capacity. But the movement as a whole, I think, is quite different. And this kind of ties back to another reference given yesterday about Enzo Traverso's work on fascism and the distinction between fascism and post-fascism, in the sense that what we see here is a family resemblance to some extent to past fascisms, but we have different modes of operationality, we have different ways of expression and different contents, different resources, different political leanings even, that makes them so different that Enzo Traverso uses the concept post-fascism in a sense. I'd say it's methodologically important to make that distinction. But it's an absolutely great question. It remains to be opened up. What happens in that social circle? Something for Kaveh, perhaps, because he works on network, right? Maybe you can do the same network thing now with Reza Pahlavi.
So I just want to say very briefly that both the Hezb Millat Iran and Pan-Iranist Party of post-1981 are, I would characterize them very different to the pre-1981 that I talked about in my research. This is a clarification that I should have made that I probably didn't. So both of them in different ways are very different. That's topic for another conversation. But none of the characterization that I made is relates to post-1981 of those parties.
تشکر از دو تا سخنران عزیز. من پرسشم این است که با توجه به این نگاه دقیقتون به این جریان‌ها و تجربه شما از یا مطالعات شما از جریان‌های مشابه اینها در جهان، در جامعه امروز ایران چه ظرفیت و فرصت‌هایی می‌بینید برای مقابله با این جریان‌های فاشیستی و در واقع پوپولیستی؟ آیا وجود دارند و کجاها هستند؟ کجا بگردیم در جامعه ایران دنبال ظرفیت‌ها و فرصت‌هایی که بشه با اینها مقابله کرد و به سوی آینده رفت؟
If
I'm
I
going to
may
quick.
translate that.
Yeah, please. Thank you.
The question is very, very important, very urgent. It's the impact of this sort of research, and with all the details that we give, as the gentleman over there said, what are the ways in which Iranian society can resist this movement and to resist the pathologies of this movement, can do something about it? To some extent, I hope that I've covered the essence of that question. And I think we have maybe we have different takes on that when it comes to question of urgency of research and the impact of research and the ways in which it can connect to society. I think it's a complicated one, but we cannot really, as scholars, give that sort of clear path towards resistance. And I think the ways that these details can be impactful is through translating these research questions and these methodologies in different sectors of the organizations and institutions involved in the transformation of Iran. So I think it's a micro level of engagement in a sense. We don't have like plans as scholars or give like do this or do that. That never comes out of scholars. But what comes out is that these research questions be meaningful for a politician who is engaged with this movement, be meaningful for a statistician to work with that, be meaningful for journalists to work with them. So these research questions and the details that Kaveh brings about from history, the details that I bring about by you looking at contemporary issues, there needs to be templates for translations across different fields. And for that much we don't have. And that's one of the crises of academia anyways. The connections with the scholars and real change is quite thin and it's difficult to make. Progress is being made in different fields. But as Iranian studies or area studies usually falling behind in terms of research relative to other fields, I think we're still far behind in translating these concerns into language that can be used by people who can bring about the resistance that you're asking about. Yes.
I don't know, but regarding your question, I think there are two references which could maybe recently could be, related to this, which is this Projet Shukufai Iran, which was announced, I think, 2 months ago, that has been started with the all Pahlavi, pro-Pahlavi people or team, that they are just coming out and they are having their fest. There are some researchers or artists. And something has started 2023 in Stanford University, which was گذار به دموکراسی, کنفرانس گذار به دموکراسی. There are also, I think, I don't know, hundreds of people who are related to Islah Talab or, I mean, Pahlavi, I mean, Saltanat Talab or whatever. Maybe these, and they are also online. You can also just read about it online, and maybe it could be a good orientation to understand and discover who are these people. I know, but I mean, these are also the people. Yes, I think they are also the political advisors. This is what I think. They are not. They don't have to be only Iranian. These, I mean, these are the international people or American technocrats who are just giving the advice. He's not just supporting by the Iranian pro-Pahlavi system.
Excuse me, if possible, can we ask questions to the speakers and then maybe have these discussions in the lunch break, which we're about to have, I think.
Can I just respond?
Yes, please, yes, if you have some.
I think historically, politically violent or politically aggressive movements, especially those who rely on mass movements, come out of anxiety of the times. And I don't think everything that happens in regard to far-right and nationalism in Iran is exact mirror of what happened in Europe or where they got their inspirations from, and the anxiety is different. For example, in Europe, those who are concerned about fascism and consider themselves anti-fascist usually look for signs such as economic security to try to identify the moments that fascists might gain political power or populist movement. In the case of Iran, it is geopolitical anxieties that often gives rise to that kind of emotions, that kind of potential for movement. So if you remember a lot of the, during the Women Life Freedom movement, a lot of the emotional mobilization of the far rights against the activists outside Iran was with the fear of Iranian borders being compromised. And even a lot of the, I genuinely don't believe a lot of the nationalist propaganda that comes from IRGC or Islamic Republic organs is just performative. I do think there is a section of Iranian establishment which I would consider Pan-Iranists. I would consider them, they would easily move to a different role in a different setup, and they are there because of anxiety that they have about regional geopolitics. So I think talking about how we can battle them in Iranian context, I think we should understand them in Iranian context first and not assume that they are exact replica of European or any other kind of form of fascism.
Yes, please.
من میخوام سوال کنم از مودراتور با احترام به گوینده های امروز. آیا دلیل این که ما الان چپ پوپولیستی نداریم دلیلش فقط شکست جهانی چپه و حمله شدید راست به چپ؟ سوالم از شماست.
راستش شما پاسخی دارین به این سوال؟ Sorry, do you have an answer?
No, go ahead. Why don't you take the...
I'll reply in English because the panel is in English. So the question was on why we don't have a populist left. I mean, it really depends, I think, what you mean on populist left. We have some forms of populist left outside Iran. I don't think they have a big resonance within Iranian society. But in general, I think that there hasn't been a concrete formulation of the concept of the populist left, which is compatible with today's Iranian society. maybe in this regard, from what we've been hearing, the populist right is further ahead, at least in the formulation of iconography and ideas on social media. We haven't seen something similar on the left. I think it also has to do with a generational problem here as well. The generation of the Iranian left is ahead with regards to the monarchy and also the supporters of the monarchy. So if we look at Reza Pahlavi, not Reza Shah, Reza Pahlavi, no, he showed Reza Shah, so I got confused. Some of the known advisors of his are people who actually came out of Iran much later than he did. You know, the Farashgad group, for example, which is a strange, very right-wing populist, I would say, and with a background in the Anjumani Islami in the Khatami era. So you see that sort of generation that goes outside Iran and forms a rather populist right-wing group is not replicated on the left. I don't think we have such a similar process happening within the ranks of the Iranian left. So there are these structural differences, I think, which are important. Kaveh, do you have something to add? Yes, please. More important.
I'm going to use this opportunity to say something that I didn't get the time to do.
Please.
The Pan-Iranists served the purpose for the Pahlavi era. They were welcomed to be the angry voice in the room. And when the Rastakhis party was formed, they were formally invited to be one of the three factions. So there was a there was a center left, center right, and they were meant to be the populist faction. So being there for the anger of people. So the populist right from 1955 onward, during Pahlavi era, had a protected status to function within the system and within the society, and therefore has a very different foundation to populist left. But also, I would argue that in post-revolution 1979, still populist right has a protected status in Islamic Republic in different shape or form, being able to function, to act as that populist voice and mobilizing people around nationalism and so on. So I think it's a very different kind of purpose that they serve to the rulers and the ruling class, even if they don't want to be observed by them during that period.
Can I add something very quickly? Sorry, because we're speaking about the Rastakhis party, it's good. I mean, Kaveh certainly knows this, but you know, the Rastakhis party was formerly formed of four parties. Four parties went into Rastakhis. So one was Hezb Mardom, one was Hezb Iran Novin. These were the two government parties. And then there were two different Pan-Iranist parties, the Pan-Iranist party, and then the Hezb Iranian. That was a splinter group out of the Rastakhis party. So think about it. At that point in time, I mean, the two obviously Pan-Iranist movements were much minor, much less important and significant in political weight compared to Mardom and Iran Novin. But two out of those four constituent parties of the Rastakhis came from the Pan-Iranist tradition. This is an important thing to note.
And also the foreign powers contributed massively during the Cold War to promote the populist right. So the Pan-Iranists, although they never were dependent on the foreign powers, they never sought to come to power by foreign powers. They received support from the U.S. Embassy in Iran. And the other parties such as Sumka, which existed in that period, definitely received as well. So sorry, just...
Thank you.
I can just say one word, just to bring back media back to this thing, is that I think that differences, or all these structural differences, are important. We can also, in terms of research and concrete outcomes of their behaviors, we can also observe how their media appearances and use of media are different, and shows us that there's this a completely asymmetrical relationship between how left uses media and mass media and how right uses mass media. So that also is open again, is an open thing to research. I don't, left populism could be a term, but then we need to open that up. Mediatization of the left also exists in literature of mediatization studies that also can be opened up. And the emotional ways in which the media is being appropriated there, and the emotionalities that we have in the right, very different kinds and degrees, so very different sorts of phenomena here really have. Just a small comment.
Can I ask a question? Sorry. This is just a pure question to Kaveh. I'll abuse my role as chair here. So regarding Pan-Iranist, a couple of quick points. I was always very fascinated by the name, right? Because this name doesn't come from the European right-wing tradition, no, the very term Pan-Iranist. So if you know anything about the etymology and then also the symbol, right? The non-equal mathematical sign that you see, especially in these big banners in the rallies of the Moscow area, you see it always in these photos. Where did that come from? Because again, Sumka aped the Nazi symbol to some extent, right? The swastika. And then the others had proto-fascist. But again, the non-equal symbol, I know what it means, obviously, the sort of contrast between Arabs and the people you mentioned that are part of Pan-Iranist. But who came up with that? Because that's quite interesting. And then the other question I have today, right? If you look at Iran today, the Pan-Iranist movement is still active. I mean, it's active semi-publicly. In certain parts of Iran, it's very active, in Khuzestan, for example. But even in Tehran, they have these circles. One of the old MPs of the monarchist era is still rather vociferous, Hushang Tahleh. He was there, no? He was part of the Pan-Iranist factions in the very last parliaments of the Pahlavi era. And then there are other sort of university professors and more who have, I mean, they're not suppressed, right? I mean, obviously they can't run for parliament, they can't run for office, but they're there and they promote Pan-Iranist ideology in an open manner. So I was wondering what you make of these activities today.
I think the name, because the first, it comes from an article from 1920s, where it argues that we need a pan-Iranist idea to stand against pan-Turkism and pan-Arabism. So it was as opposition to, again, that anxiety about borders and that. I don't draw a direct line on what is called today a pan-Iranist party and the pan-Iranist movement that I'm talking about. I think there is some significant ideological differences in many ways, although they use the same iconography.
And there's some human continuity as well.
There is definitely, but I think one of the privileges of doing historical research is I can just say I stopped in 1981 and escape from actually answering.
Any last questions? We still have a couple of minutes for questions. Please, yes. And the symbol you don't really know. Not equal. It's mystery.
و اینو میخوام ارتباط بدم با اینکه چه ویژگی هایی در جامعه ما وجود داره که علیرغم اینکه ما تجربه نه چندان دوری از این رشد جریان های فاشیستی یا پوپولیستی در ایران داریم، باز هم شاهدش هستیم. اون زمینه چیه که این جریان ها رشد میکنه؟ این یک سواله. و من یه خطری احساس میکنم که بیش از اون که این امکان وجود داشته باشه که این جریان‌های پوپولیستی فاشیستی یه جنبشی راه بندازن در ایران، بیش از اون این خطر وجود داره که از جنبش‌هایی که راه میافتن اینا بهره بگیرن و به نوعی اونو تصاحب کنن. علت این چیه؟ ما کجاها میتونیم باز دنبال ظرفیت‌ها و پتانسیل‌هایی بگردیم که مقابله بتونیم بکنیم شاید از اینکه این جریان‌های پوپولیستی و فاشیستی از جریان‌ها و جنبش‌هایی که راه می‌افتن اونو در واقع تصاحب کنند.
Okay, yeah, it's a $1 million question. I mean, this absolutely, I mean, you're putting us in a situation that we don't have the expertise to answer. It's fine, but no, it's okay. But what? How many minutes?
2 minutes.
2 minutes is good. I can answer 2 minutes. It's fine. Yeah. But you talked about the context, the zaminahai ijtimai, the ways in which the society is prone to be manipulated by populist movements, and also you mentioned importantly that sometimes these movements are being hijacked by other movements. And I think, again, I'm not in any position to answer truthfully or productively, but I can only say that when we are in a mediatized world in which collective memory instead of historical knowledge reigns and drives attitudes. And when media is more effective rather than informative, the media is more about how to get more emotional response from the audience rather than being involved in the complexities of institutions and worlds, then I think we have a very kind of dark situation in which we can't really do much about these things. And I can only say that the situation is not that the scholars would put something out there, but it's more that they have to be involved on the micro level of engagement with people who are working in different institutions to, again, translate these concerns to institutions of power who are involved in different ways with different societies. It could be just NGOs, ranging from NGOs to governments or whatever. These are really micro level and very sort of specialized ways in which these concerns can be actually implemented. But in the ways that someone comes on the screen and says, oh, I think that you should do this and that, and do not talk about, I don't know, populism is bad, or taking normative stances, or ethical, or even moral stances, that's not going to get us anywhere. That's the short answer.
Okay, I think we've reached the end of this very lively and interesting panel. I would like to thank both Kaveh and Arash for having delivered their wonderful speeches, and thank you, and I think it's lunchtime. Thank you very much. Thank you.